So this session is designing with CSS, and let me explain a little bit what I wanted to do with this. So you guys, if you don't like it, you can leave early. So a lot of times we talk about CSS, we go feature first, right? We go, well, here's this feature of CSS, and here's this feature of CSS, and then strive to get a use case for it to show off in isolation what it is. What I want to do is go the other way. Let's start with the problems. Let's start with interfaces that I like from various places, and then design them with CSS, and then use that to pull out. So I use this feature, here's how that works, here's this feature, how's that work? So basically start with the problem, and then go to the solution in CSS, as opposed to, I want to show you all these new features. So that's sort of the approach I have here. I'm going to start easy, and I'll admit the first kind of stuff I do is a little bit like to get into this mindset of doing this. It's basic, and then I'll go into different UIs as I go through. I'll start with like basic columns and laying out text, and then move to some image cropping stuff that I like from the interface of all places PowerPoint. Then move into some of the an interface that I really like from Facebook. Then I'll move into interfaces that I like from iOS 6. And then I'll finish up with something I like from iOS 7. So that's kind of the goal. That's the game plan here. So I'm going to poll real quick just to see who you guys are, see kind of what level we're coming from. Who here sees themselves solely as a web developer? Solely as a web designer? Kind of, you do both as part of your, okay, cool. How many people here absolutely love CSS, can't wait to do stuff in CSS? Okay, how many people think those that just raised their hands are absolutely crazy? Okay, how many people are sort of indifferent to the technology, it gets the job done, but they don't particularly enjoy it? Okay, all right, cool. All right, that gives me a good cross-section of you guys. You guys are kind of broad. Also, how many people here are incredibly comfortable with, like, how many people feel like they've mastered CSS? They know exactly how to get their vision. CSS, great. Awesome, good. Because if people like knew everything about CSS, like, you're going to hate this, right? So, all right. So some important ideas to start. I'm going to use phrases like avoid, and what I mean by avoid is very clearly consider using other options before you do this. Not never, right? Things are suboptimal, but they have uses, so make sure that you don't take anything I see here as like an absolute. Same thing with prefer. Doesn't mean always. So I'll start with my first one, which is avoid adding extra HTML. I'm a sort of a semantic zealot. I really believe in keeping HTML as lean as possible. And so in these solutions, I sometimes violate this rule. Know that I secretly hate myself every time I do that. I guess not secretly now that I've said it. You guys know. But I really try to avoid adding extra HTML to achieve something in CSS. I also prefer using CSS for alt display. A lot of times you can do something with less effort, doing it in JavaScript, pulling in a library, pulling in something to make things a little bit easier. But I really fundamentally believe that you should avoid doing that for many reasons, but mostly because I feel like you're better off progressively enhancing in CSS than progressively enhancing with JavaScript. It's my own personal view on it, but I think you end up with better performance and better flexibility when you stick with CSS. And again, prefer. There are cases where you just can't do things, and one of the things I do here, you absolutely have to use JavaScript to get it done because it's reacting to a user event, and that's fine. But for actually changing the way things look and feel, I really firmly believe stay in CSS. So with that out of the way, start with the first thing. Columns. Very simple, very basic. Going to get you into this. We're going to break apart a design problem and solve it with CSS. So columns have gotten very important in terms, I know it's a little light, but you can kind of see there's a flexible grid there. Columns have gotten very important as we deal with responsive web design, dealing with having text fill and shrink in order to respond to different devices. Having columns and grids is something that you really need to do. And for most cases, you're going to use some sort of framework to achieve this. But it's good to know the underlying tech so that if you need to do something very simple and very easy, you know what the problem is when something breaks. So here's my initial column design. And this is not designed for comfort, right? This is designed for clarity, so you can see where everything is laying out. And if I look at this, it doesn't lay out it's not too bad. It's pretty relatively straightforward. I've got 3 divs. I set each div to have a width of 33%, and then I float them all left. And so as I can expand and contract my screen, it'll, for the most part, lay out like I want it there in thirds. But looking at that, I'm really not happy with the way the text is lining up. I really want there to be padding inside those blocks. And so typically what you'll do is you'll add, and you'll see it right down here, I'll add 10 pixels of padding to both sides for 20 pixels of padding, 10 on each side of the columns. And when I do that, this is the result I get, right? Or as I like to see it, float. Now, the reason why this happens is pretty straightforward. You guys have run into this, I would hope, right? Okay. And the reason is pretty straightforward. It's because I set everything to 33%, and then I added 20 pixels to the outside of each one of those items, which makes it 99% plus 60 pixels being greater than 1%, which forces it onto the next line. But you can get this with that padding and not have to fool around with anything crazy and math and everything. All you have to do is change what's called the box model. So by adding this one set of CSS, border box, set box sizing to border box, I change the way things lay out, and I get this. Now what border box does in CSS is it changes the model from I take padding and I add it to the outside. Instead, when I add padding to the width of something, it subtracts it from the inside. So this is a very minor fix you can do, but will change the way stuff lays out. So if you want to do stuff in percentages and not have to worry about padding and adding crazy percent padding and doing math and all that, it's a lot simpler, a lot cleaner to just set border box. And the support for this goes pretty far back, so you can be confident that you can use this without causing massive amounts of problems. Just as a show of hands, how far back are you guys supporting in general? Are you guys going back to, we'll start IE9, IE8, IE7, IE6? Please, for the love of God, no? Okay. Oh, good. All right. I was like, oh, we're going to get back to like Netscape 4 if I keep going. Okay, so obviously IE6, IE7, your mileage will vary, but IE8 and forward, I'm pretty sure is okay with border box.
Can you show the CSS one more time, please?
What was that? Does it show the CSS one more time? There's the CSS. And also, I'll have a link at the end of this to the slides and all the references. So if you forget to take a note, I'm happy to just point you there. All right. So the next thing is this, and we're all probably familiar with this. I floated all of my columns, and now the containing element doesn't contain anything, because when you float something, you take it out of the box layout model, and so the item that's containing it has no height because it has nothing in it that has height. Now the old fix for this was to do something like this: BR style clear both. Okay, if you guys are familiar, you guys have done this at some point? I see heads shaking, good. But this violates my rule of I don't like adding extra stuff. And a lot of other people have that same conceit. And so they achieve this same look and feel by doing this bit of CSS, which is called a clear fix. People are familiar with clear fix? Yes? Okay, good. So I won't belabor it too much. But there's clear fix for you, and then you achieve that. So we went over two concepts here: border box model and clear fix. Okay? I realize I have links there, more info, which do you no good because the links, you can't click on those links. But I do have the references at the end, so if you want to go and find out more info, you absolutely can. So next I'm going to move on to PowerPoint. And you might be surprised because I clearly don't like PowerPoint, right? Because I'm doing my Prezzo in HTML. But making that move from doing my Prezzos in PowerPoint to making my Prezzos in HTML was a little bit painful because there's some things that I really like that PowerPoint does that you can't do in HTML easily. I'm going to start with the first very, very basic one, which is this. If you look, I have bullets because what is a presentation without bullets, right? You have to, it's the law, right? You have to have bullet points. Now, if you look, the bullet is a different color than the text, which is not obvious how to do in HTML from the get-go. And so let me just show you a couple ways of doing it. So let me launch. First, I'll show the wrong way, or what I think is the wrong way. And I'll launch the live view there. There we go. All right. So I achieve what I want here in that I've got a red bullet with black text. And the way I do that is I wrap my stuff in spans and then color the LI one way and color the span the second way. And that will work. But it violates my rule of I added extra HTML and I don't like that. So what do I think the right way to do that is? Well, the first right way is this. And let me pull up the CSS. Say, nope. There we go. All right. Okay. Let me line this up so we can see both the editor and the browser here as I go through. Okay. So the first thing I do is I turn off list styles. Right? Makes sense. I'm going to replace the list with something else. The next thing I do is I add content to before. And I'll explain what that crazy string is, but basically it's an escaped entity. And I'll explain that more. But basically that will create a circle, a very, very tiny circle. So then I go through and I make that circle red, and I bump up the font so that it's displaying a little bit better. And then I change the line height, so it kind of brings it a little bit more in line. And then I'll make the position relative so that I can knock it 15 pixels down from the top. And then I forget why I do inline block. Oh, I do inline block so the next thing will work. I make its width 30 pixels so you get the right size. And then lastly, I pull it over negative 33 pixels to get it exactly where I want it. So that's a lot of work. But I'm able to achieve what I want without adding any extra HTML. And this, once you understand what's going on with all this, it actually makes a fair amount of sense. It's relatively straightforward and easy to do. There is, however, a second way of doing this, which is a lot simpler and a lot more elegant, but doesn't have the support as far back as that method, which is this. Very simple. I change the list style to use an image, and that image is a SVG red bullet. It was basically just a circle written in SVG. The advantage there is that this is really simple, really easy, don't really have to worry about positioning anything, don't have to put anything in any place. If I look at the SVG file, like in terms of size, it's really, like it's 7 lines of text to get that, so it's really light. And if I increase this, you'll see that it grows reasonably well with it. The last thing I had done, let's see, the right way, they do grow, but you have to be kind of careful with how you position and everything to get it to work right. But those are 2 ways, I think, of achieving this. So either doing it in SVG or doing it with that convoluted create something before and put it beforehand. Yes?
Can you show the CSS?
Show for which one?
The short one.
The short one, sure. Also right. There you go. That's it. I didn't even bother breaking it into another file. All I do is use the list style image and replace the image. Now I could use a PNG to do that as well. The downside being it won't scale well. Whereas this, because it's SVG, will scale very cleanly and very, very prettily. So any questions before I move on to the next thing? All right, so the next interface I like from PowerPoint. Let me explain what I did there before I go to the next interface I like. So the first thing I did was add a pseudo element, which was the before and after. The way pseudo elements work is here's a div, and I've got a class of pseudotest with pithy quote in it, and it renders as that when I render it. Now I'm going to add a before and after, and you'll see I'm just going to add a pound sign before and after the item that I have, and it comes out as this. Now, one of the things that's confusing about before and after, and it took me a while to wrap my mind around, was that you think before means, well, I have this div, I will place this, whatever I'm placing ends up before the div or after the div. But that's not what before means. It means before the first child and after the last child. Probably because before the last child or before the first child would be very hard, very long to write in CSS. So they saved us a couple of lines there, but it makes it a little bit more confusing. So the idea is that it's going to insert whatever content you have into the item before the first child or after the last child. So you have to watch that whatever CSS you've applied to the item will apply to it because it is in fact a child of that. Does that make sense? I used a lot of this and that's there. We cool? All right, good. All right, so that's pseudo elements. The next thing is character entities, which was that circle that I created for the dot. So you guys are probably familiar with HTML entities even if you aren't aware. You know that if you want to write an ampersand in HTML, you usually write ampersand amp semicolon. Or if you really want to be clever and confuse people, you can use ampersand pound sign 38. In CSS, that same thing is content slash 0026, and in JavaScript, the same thing is slash 46. And basically, the only way to do this is there's like a table out in the web somewhere that has all of this out, and that's what I use to do it. You might ask, why are none of these numbers the same? And both times I've given this presentation, I've researched this because like maybe the answer is out there, maybe I figured it out, and all I can figure out is that standards writers hate you. There is no real good, like there's some explanation about ISO and UTC, like it is complete gibberish. It's because people didn't want to work together. And that's why none of these things are the same. I'm sure the people involved have a much better reason, or they have a much more polished reason, but I really think this is what it is. So, any questions before I move on? Okay, so the next interface I like is PowerPoint makes it really easy to crop images that you use in your presentation. That is in fact my daughter, and that really does sum up her personality. Sticking out her tongue in a tutu. So I really like that, and I want to do that in HTML. How do I go about doing that? The idea to crop. So let me pull up some HTML here. So you'll see here I've got some very basic HTML. I wrap my image in a div picture holder, and that's all I give to it. And when I live preview, here it comes. I'll break that out. There we go. And let's do this with CSS. Okay, so the first thing is I have this picture holder around this image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the picture holder. I'm going to set the overflow to hidden, so anything extra gets lopped off. I'm going to give it a width of 300 pixels and height of 300 pixels, and give it a border, just 1 pixel around it, and that yields this, right? Which, it's good. It cropped it, but it's not necessarily what I want to see. So the next thing I do is I go to the image, and I set its position to relative, which will make me be able to use left and top properly. So then I go and set left to negative 300 pixels and top to negative 80. So I pull it over and pull it up, and there's my daughter's face. Now I want to go a little bit further with this, because like one of the things you can do in PowerPoint is you can add like kind of nice borders around stuff, and while you can't do as much of that in HTML as you can, I can make this look sort of like a Polaroid. So I'll go through and I will accidentally recomment it. There we go. I'll add a border, a thick border there, and then I added some drop shadow to it, some box shadow to it too, so it kind of stands out. And so I've got this nice little Polaroid effect there. She will never know what a Polaroid is, but I can at least make her image look like that. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the image to make it sort of feel a little bit more like it's a real thing. I rotate it 10 degrees, and now I have it sort of sticking off the side, so it's like I pinned it on the page. And then the last thing I'm going to do is something I can't do in every browser, so don't rely on this, but it's something nice you can do, as I kind of said beforehand, the nice little progressive enhancement to it. I can add a filter. So let's say I want this to make it look like it was it's not from 2013. I want to make it look like it was from the 70s. I want to add a sepia filter, pretty basic. I can do that too by adding a WebKit filter, sepia 50%, and there my daughter has been aged into the past with sepia. So pretty basic, pretty straightforward. What I love about this is that I've completely changed the way this image looks without changing the content. I didn't have to edit the image in Photoshop. I didn't have to do anything with it. I just applied some CSS, and there we go. And if something were to happen and you don't get it, the image is still there in the source, so someone can look at it directly. It's okay. So what concepts did I do there to make that work? So the first thing is position. Position is one of those things that like everyone thinks they know. But most people that deal with CSS, unless they actively investigate and read up on position, don't really understand what it does. So the first part is position static, which is what everything does, which is you lay stuff out, and wherever it is in the order of the box model is exactly where it's going to lay out. And the only thing that impacts how stuff lays out is block versus inline. If it's block, it'll clear to the next line. If it's inline, it'll be next. So when I do that, I get pithy quote. Even if I push it down 30 pixels, it's still appearing exactly where it's supposed to, because that 30 pixels pushed down from the top has no impact because it's position static. If, however, I position it relatively and I push it down 30 pixels with top 30, it's going to push down 30 pixels from where it was supposed to be. 30 pixels from where it was supposed to be in the box model according to everything else. So when I do that, you'll see that pithy quote gets pushed down 30 pixels from the top of that box. The next one is absolute. And absolute is a little bit complicated. It will lay out from wherever you say in relation to the parent that is not the closest parent that is not position relative, or it's not position static. Barring you having an item containing it that is position relative, or any of the other positions between it and the top of the document, it'll lay out from the top of the document. So when I push this down 30 pixels and make it absolute, you'll see that the thing that contained it completely collapses because you've pushed it out of the box model, and it's 30 pixels from the top. The last one is fixed. Which doesn't show up right in this presentation. It shows up right if I do just this normal demo of it. But what it's supposed to do is it'll make it it's sort of like absolute if you don't have anything non-static in between. It'll position it 30, in this case, 0 pixels from the top and 0 pixels to the right of the browser window. Reveal.js, which is a presentation, framework that I'm using, messes around with this, so it doesn't lay out properly, but it should be normal. Under normal circumstances, it will be over the top right of the browser. So that's position. Yes?
When you're talking about relative and how it's according to the box model, if you're using a border box and you're changing around kind of the structure of the box model, will that have any effect on the way the positioning works?
Wow, that's a great question. Yes and no.
Okay.
So it'll still be 30 pixels from where it was supposed to lay out, but if you have a border box, where it lays out will be different than where it would be if you didn't do border box. Okay. But once you change the border box and you see where it's going to be, when you move it relatively 30 pixels from where it's supposed to be, it'll be from the right spot. Like,
Okay.
does that make sense?
Yeah. So it'll just be in relation to the changes that you're making normally with border box and how.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions before I? Yes?
How do you get things to be persistently in the middle all the time, no matter which browser?
You pray. There's a lot of great stuff coming out of the Flexbox property in CSS, but barring using Flexbox, right now the only way to do that consistently is to use JavaScript, which is incredibly frustrating because it's centering a damn image. Like, we should be able to do that, but CSS hates us. So, sorry, that's not the answer you wanted, but I would use JavaScript to achieve that. For now, Flexbox has a lot of promise, but Flexbox is also not as widely supported yet as we'd like it to be. So transforms. The next thing I did was I transformed, right? So I have pithy quote, and I put a transform on it, and I rotate it 30 degrees in that case. And of course, I have to write it 4 times because, as I've mentioned, browser manufacturers hate us. So I can do that. I can also skew it. I can also do multiple. So I can do multiple transforms on the same object with one line. And I have a whole number of options of things that I can do with transforms. I can scale it, I can rotate it, skew it, and translate things via 3D. And basically, I have a whole wide range of options to do here. And support for transforms is really getting very good, especially across mobile platforms. It's really good. Desktop browsers, you still have to go a couple versions. You still have the problem of old versions, but for the most part, this is something you can start relying on more and more. Yes?
Are they, when you're doing the rotation, is it from the center of the element?
You can mark that. You can say, like, by default, I think it's top 0, 0, top layer. But you can move that so it moves it somewhere else, I think. You definitely can move that. I forget where it starts. I'm pretty sure it's at 0, 0.
Okay.
So I should, what's that?
It does by
Yeah.
default start at 0, 0.
Good. So next is filters. So let me start with, so that was the sepia thing I did on the image. Let me start with a piece of SVG. I'm going to add a sepia filter to it, which I did before. Of course, I get an aged look on that red marker. If instead I saturate it, I can get magenta, I guess, out of it. Now here's a kind of interesting conundrum. So I have that shape, right? And I want to add a box shadow to it. And what box shadow does is it applies a shadow to the containing box that an image is in. So if I have something like this, it's going to do this, which is sort of suboptimal, right? I'm breaking the illusion there of having this sort of image floating there. What I can do, however, is with drop shadow in filters, I can apply to the transparency of the item. So this works for SVG, but it also works for PNG. So you can use transparent PNGs and actually get the shadows to look right around the edges of the PNG. This is, and you have a whole bunch of options: grayscale, saturating, hue, rotate, invert, opacity, brightness, blur. Some of these have performance implications, so test them out before you start, to make sure that you don't run afoul of performance issues. Like, for example, blur. If you blur too much and try to do movement on the blur, you will get performance problems. But just a simple little blur is not a problem. It's like when you rotate something, you animate a rotation on something and have it spinning and then blur it, and your browser, we're just not optimized for that yet. So those are sort of your options with filters. They are they're implemented in WebKit, and so they are implemented in Blink. We got it in before the fork. So you're going to be able to use this on on Chrome, Android, and both iOS browsers. So concepts we went over. Went over pseudo elements, went over HTML entities, went over SVG. In that, I showed an SVG image. I guess at some point in the past I talked more about SVG, but I feel like today you probably have gotten your full of SVG. Position, transforms, and filters. Okay, any questions before I move on to the next interface? Yes?
What's the, with the drop shadow filter, what does it fall back to on browsers that don't support it?
Nothing.
Okay, so it just won't show up at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Al?
It's also in Safari.
What is filters got? Okay, cool. I already thought it was, so. But it was added in filters? It was added in Mavericks? Okay. Waving me off. All right. So the next interface I want to show off is something from Facebook. Now, if you guys have used Facebook on a mobile device, are you guys familiar with this, the chat heads interface? I really like it. It's really simple, really elegant. I like it. So I wanted to see how hard or easy it would be to do in HTML. And it's actually relatively simple. So let me go to chat heads, and we'll go with single. And there I am. For some reason, I'm incredibly angry. I don't know. So basically, all I have is an image. I give it a class of chat head. That's all the HTML I'm doing here. So all of the manipulation is going to happen in CSS. Okay. So the first thing is I want to shrink it down to not be quite so massive. So, okay, so width and height of 150, and then I'm going to add a border radius of 75 pixels so that it'll make it circular. So one cool thing about border radius is that if you set it to half of the width of the item, it'll turn into a circle because that's the way the math works out. You actually can go higher with this. So if I set this to 175, still the same effect. So if you have something with border radius, if you have something of variable width and you want it to be a circle all the time, you could set your border radius to and it'll still just be a circle. Now watch for that because at some point maybe something will happen and negative border radii can happen, but it's just a little tip when you're not sure. What's that? 50%. 50%. That'll work too. Very good. Yeah. So the next thing I'm going to do is add a border to it. Just a simple little outline like there is in Facebook. I'll add a box shadow so that it kind of highlights out from the thing. And then I'm going to position it absolutely. And when I do that, you'll see it takes it out of the box model. And then I'm going to set it -10 pixels from the right, which will give that effect of being mostly on, but a little bit off, which matches the way Facebook does it. It's a little bit off. And so there we go. Now, that's pretty cool, and I like that interface, but Facebook actually makes things a little bit more complicated. If you have multiple people in the same chat conversation, it lays out like this. So I've got the last person gets 50% and pushed over in it, and then the next two people come up as quarters. So how would I do this? So this one is a little bit more complicated, clearly. I'll go multiple and multiple. Oh, all right. I forgot to Julia Child this one. Hold on a sec. All right. So there you see I've got 4 images, 4 people in a conversation. So that way we can see what happens when we have more than 3 to make this really kind of universally work. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create that circular interface, but I'm going to create it for the chat head multiple for all of it. So all of them are going to live in a circle here. So nothing too crazy. Pretty much everything I did in the last one, make it a circle, give it a border, pull it over, and you'll see that only my ear is showing. So there we go. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make all the images disappear. And I don't like this because I'm going to then undo it. But I think this is the most elegant way to do it so that anything over the first 3 don't get shown. So I'll display none them all. And you'll see I've got the circle is still there, but they're not displaying. So then the next thing I do is I go through and play with image nth child. And that little calculation there is saying basically for the first 3 images, for the first 3 images in that set, do this. So I'm going to display them inline block with a width of 75, height of 75, and position them absolutely. And when I do that, you'll see that I get a little quarter view there. The next thing I'll do is I'm going to fool around with the first one, and you'll see I'll target first child, and I'll go through and say, set it to 150 by 150. And when I do that, you'll see that my image comes up. It's taken up half. I then pull it using a negative margin or a negative left to pull it over to the left so it lines up exactly where it should be. And then I give it a border of 1 pixel and only on the right-hand side. So then for the nth child number 2, or the second image, I'll make it 75 pixels and it'll move it over there to the right. And then for the last one, I'll do the same thing, make it 75 pixels and move it over to the right. And there we go. So I've got the whole interface there, exactly the way it's done in Facebook, but pulled over. Any questions about that before I move forward? Yes?
What's the negative n plus 3?
What's the negative in the
Nth child?
in left?
Yeah,
Line 21.
Line 21.
Why the negative n plus 3?
Negative n plus 3. I couldn't tell you. I got this from a table of how to select things, and I have a reference to it. But basically, I'm sure someone who understands set theory and math could explain it a little bit better to you. I just know that this negative n plus 1 selects the first 3.
Oh,
And then the nth child stuff, that's all part of the CSS standard?
Yes. Goes back across all browsers, a couple versions back. I forget exactly where it starts.
IE8 and below has issues with that.
IE8 and below, thank you. So okay, so that's nth child. Did some negative margins, did some negative things. Now I want to take this a little bit further. I'm not going to bother showing off the CSS for it because it's mostly the same thing. But I wanted to say you could take the same thing and with just a little bit of JavaScript to change classes, I can actually get this to expand out so I can see all 4 people and display that properly. All I do there is just a little creative class changing, and that'll do that. The last thing I do with this is one of the problems I have with the Facebook model is I have content, and the content is being obscured by this chat window, and that makes sense within the Facebook user interface, but I kind of don't like that. So what I would rather see it do is multiple expand and exclude. Is actually I add a float to it. All I do is instead of positioning it absolutely, I position it with float. And so float makes sure that it pulls it out and pulls it out of the model so it's not obscuring anything behind it. I think I add, and I don't bother pulling it all the way to the right. I think I experimented with negative margins and I wasn't happy with how I got it, but I feel like this is a good compromise. It doesn't obscure text and it's in the right spot. But this isn't as cool as it could possibly be because I think we showed off some stuff today. It says we can do stuff a little bit better. So that's using Canary and that's using shape exclusions, and you'll see there on that version that there's sort of it's showing the circular, right? I'm at it at an angle, but you can see that it curves around that. Okay. Originally, when I had this, I'm going to cop to it. We changed some of this stuff, and so originally when I had it, all of them would exclude properly, and it looks like they are. You just can't see it. So something happened with so it doesn't work fully as well. But you can kind of see here that I have that only excluding in a circular shape, which is, I think, really kind of cool, and some of the promise of some of that shape stuff that we showed off earlier today. So that that's what I got here on chat heads. Let me see here. So as I go through, I got 10 minutes left. The concepts we went through here are pretty straightforward. We did border radius to make a circle. We used box shadow to give a little bit more look and feel. We used nth child to target specific elements within a set of elements. We used float, and we used shape outside, which is still experimental and only only works in cutting edge, in nightly non-mainstream browsers yet. So any questions on that before I move forward?
Just a comment, that Alice thing that they did would be cool with that.
Yeah, I was using a.
As you scroll through the screen, if you were scrolling through the text, if the circle could stay there and just change.
Yep, you absolutely could. When I wrote this demo, I was using an earlier version of the spec, and so I didn't go into as much stuff. So let's see, I got 10 minutes left. So I can show off iOS 6, but I don't do anything terribly crazy there. So I'm going to take a step forward, and with my last couple minutes, I'm going to do something from iOS 7, because I really kind of like it, which is this. This is the lock screen of my iOS device. I wanted to see if I could render that in HTML. There's a couple things going on here. One, I have an image of the Earth that's behind the main screen. I have all of these numbers that are circles. So I have a lot of interface here to play with. So let me show that off. iOS 7 index. So the HTML is kind of actually pretty complex. I have a whole number of LIs with A's and some spans, and I broke my rule about adding HTML, but I kind of had to. But it's relatively simple, and it makes sense. So how do I get to here in HTML? So, oh good. All right, so bear with me. I'll launch this. So here you see this is the bare bones with no style whatsoever. And I'm going to start going through and styling it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick, there we go. Whoa. There we go. Okay. So I set it to Helvetica New, kind of matching the weight, the very lightweight Helvetica. I had the border box model. I had basically just some background colors, nothing too crazy. Now I'm going to start, I go through and make sure that all the arefs are white. I'm going to size this properly so that it's sized out to the size of an iPhone interface. I'll add some positioning so that when I start moving stuff around, it goes the right way. I'll move that content. I change the font weight to make it the right size there. Add some padding to the header. Lay out the header properly so that it's two pieces and they're on either side of each other. I'll move the battery indication over to the right. If I had a little bit more time, I probably would have added the icon, but I figured you'd let me pass because the interesting part of the interface is not the header. The next thing I do is there are these digits here that when you start typing your passcode, they light up. So I basically do them with HTML entities, bullets. I wrap them in spans so that I could give them a margin and spread them out the way they're actually lined up in the interface. Then for the keypad, basically I get rid of the list styling. And then here's where I make everything circular and bump up the font and lay them out. Again, I'm not doing anything new that I haven't shown already. I go through the margin. I'm going to move the 0 over to the middle. Auto margining didn't make it go where I wanted to go, so I had to do it that way. I make it block so that the numbers all lay out where I want them to. I make the span block for the letters and then dump it down onto another line. And then I finish down at the bottom here really quick by getting rid of the list style, making them both half of the size. I pad a little bit on the left, and I line and pad on the right. And then finally, I'm going to add the background. When I add the background, you'll see it comes out here but it's very clear, which is not really what we do, what the way the iOS interface does with that. So what we want to do is we want to blur it and set the brightness down to 5, and then I get this part of the interface. Now here, I didn't do anything new, but I didn't use anything that I hadn't used previously, but I wanted to kind of say, look, you can take all the stuff I did and apply it forward. When brand new interfaces come out, you can still achieve them. Now, this is not perfect. If we look at the original real interface, there's one more thing that's happening here, which is these circles. If I look here, these circles are white. If I look here, they're not white. They're actually blended with the background. They're a little bit brighter versions of the background. The way to do that would be with compositing, which is not as far along as any other some of the new CSS stuff that I was showing you. So unfortunately, I could not get it to work. But eventually, you'll be able to composite entities with their background, or elements with their background, so that I actually could get them to lay out the proper way. But I'm going to argue that this is really close to the full version. Not perfect, but really close. So that's iOS 7. So I'm going to conclude, and then I'll have some time for questions and answers. But why do this? 10 years ago, CSS Garden came around and had this crazy idea of, hey, you can have the same content and just show it in completely different ways with CSS. And that was great, but it was sort of an academic exercise. It was theoretical. Then responsive web design came around and made that not theoretical, that made that actually something you really have to do. You have to make the same content look completely different ways. And that's just to deal with the devices we have today. What's coming down the pike, right? Like Google Glass probably won't, but could become a thing, right? iPhone wrist could happen, might not. Minority Report could happen. We've seen it. Fox News just has this new crazy interface in their newsroom. It really comes down to, we have no idea what the future is going to look like, but making your content and having control of how it displays and where it displays using CSS makes it a lot easier to prepare for the unknown. With that, that's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, if you have want to find out any of the references or any of the material, terrenceryan.com/thanks takes all the references, all the articles that I used to make this presentation are all referenced there. So thank you guys very much. And I believe does the next session start at 11:30? 11:40. Okay, so good. I left time for questions. So any questions? Yes.
First, thank you. It was a great session. I think the best so far that I've attended in this show.
Well, thank you.
You are very passionate about not cluttering your HTML with some spans and stuff. And maybe it works in a big organization where there are tons of people who can work on that. But if I'm more of a pragmatic approach, and get stuff done, and carrying this complexity to the CSS has a lot of price by itself. So
that's a really good point. And that's why I make sure I say avoid and prefer instead of saying like it's a universal rule. But I argue that it depends on what you're being pragmatic about. If you're being pragmatic about getting it the simplest solution for today, then absolutely you're going to add extra HTML and you're not going to worry about semantics too much, and that's fine. If you're being pragmatic long term, and the idea that where I display this might be completely different, and so if I keep my HTML as undisplayed as possible and as simple as possible and do everything through CSS, which can adapt to the different environments it's in, it's long term, I think it's a better play, and it's just being pragmatic in a different approach. One of the cool examples I've seen of this is Boston Globe, which was like the first responsive web design. It was all great. When Google Glass was released, first thing those guys did was look at it in Google Glass, which is a completely different interface. And a lot of things broke when you looked at it in Google Glass because it's a completely different way of looking at stuff. A Boston Globe site worked. And it's that sort of pragmatism to say, we're gonna spend a little pain in the beginning and get the content, preserved so that we can display it different ways, different places. I think it bears out. Now, granted, we're not all the Boston Globe, but I feel like I'd rather spend the time now instead of spending the time later to kind of fix. Well, that's my answer to that. Long answer to a very short question. Yes?
So I've noticed you have pixels in CSS. Do you use pixels for responsive design, or do you?
No, for the most part, for responsive design, I stick to rems, not even just ems, rems, the relative ems. For this type of thing where I'm getting an exact perfect, I tend to use pixels just because math isn't always there. But depends on what you want to do. If you're doing responsive and you're not doing crazy little interfaces like that, I would stick with rems and or percentages.
And then you have different pixels for different devices.
Yep. Yes?
The SVG, is SVG like an HTML with some data, or does it actually reference an image?
So I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
SVG?
Okay, what about the SVG?
Is SVG like just like a HTML bracket with some data inside it, or does it reference an image?
SVG is its own format. It's an XML format, but it is a text-based format. So you lay everything out via text.
So it doesn't reference another image, right?
No.
Okay, so how does that compare to like the data URI 64-bit thing?
It depends. I like having them separate, but then again, that is a separate download. So it really is going to depend on how lean you need to get it. I find using the data and everything to be somewhat obscuring of what I'm trying to do, and having it be a separate image file with its separate SVG file. I find that to be a little bit more clear from a development intention perspective. But there are cases where you need to squeeze every ounce of performance out of what you're doing, and putting it in that would be a better call. So I'd say your mileage may vary. I prefer SVG just because I feel it's a little less opaque from a other developer standpoint. I'm going to take one more question, and then I'm going to break down for the next session. Yes?
When do you think, so it's great that we can do all this stuff on your phone and on the web, but when you look at email, and whether it be using Gmail, or you can barely use any of this. Do you have any idea, is there ever any discussion about when there's going to sort of close the gap?
Between HTML for email and HTML for everywhere else? The answer is no, and why would you even ask that? Right? I say it with a joke. I don't know. I mean, it's worse. There seems to be absolutely no consensus on how to on mail manufacturers of how to render stuff in a mail client. And I don't see that changing anytime soon because there's not as much pressure on them to work together. Like browser manufacturers have to work together. Mail client users don't seem to care. And there does seem to be absolutely no consensus there. I wish I could give you a better answer, but
It seems like there's a lot of lost
yeah.
opportunity.
Yeah, no, it clearly is. I don't know why. But yeah. All right, thank you guys very much. And I'll be around for a little bit, so feel free to ask your questions.